principal minority world institutions, there's quite a risk of a deep disillusionment with how they function, and that's operating at two main levels. On the one hand, you have citizens who feel frustrated at their institutions' denial of their responsibility to those who are really most vulnerable in the world. But at the same time, there are citizens in these minority world contexts that feel betrayed by their institutions' lack of recognition, either of their own vulnerabilities at their doorstep, or also of their own local privileges. We must reckon with just how real this privilege is. Almost anyone attending the State of the Union is in the top 10% of world income earners. And that top 10% earns half of the global income and holds 3/4 of global wealth. Therefore, at this intersection between how we recognize and how we account for our privilege and how we account for different vulnerabilities, institutions are facing a very real tension in responding to their populations. So in how institutions posit their responsibilities locally and globally, we're also seeing the potential for quite a fundamental shift in the assumptions on which these institutions were built. Obviously, societies have changed since they were first created, but we shouldn't lose sight of the assumptions that underpin them. Assumptions of material accumulation, of competition, of exploitation, things that are suddenly starting to be taken as not for granted anymore. One of the key discussion points that we want to see is how we measure and understand different vulnerabilities around the world. So we have vulnerabilities at our doorstep, but we also have very fundamental historical intersections that make vulnerabilities particularly distinct. In doing that, we need ways of measurement that make the understanding of this vulnerability effective for policymaking, but also for those communities. In doing so, we want to see the systemic interconnections in policymaking. So policies that are not only addressing a single issue or a single context in one moment, but actually understanding the deep roots of everything that's around them and how they're having systemic effects in other policy areas. To do that, there needs to be a deep citizen involvement. So to see citizens as collaborators in this policymaking and in understanding how to improve their situations. And there specifically, we really want to see localized knowledge from communities that have had histories and ways of existing with nature that are much more harmonious than what we've traditionally seen in our institutions. Much of our generation sees the need for quite a systemic rhetoric shift in how our institutions are operating. There's a deep recognition that we should not be imposing this double burden on the most vulnerable communities in the world, i.e., leaving them not only the responsibility to face the challenges that they're facing in climate change, but also the responsibility to communicate and advocate for those issues. Through social media and through everything that our generation is exposed to today, we have a much more ingrained knowledge and awareness that there are deep climate realities that we don't know and that we will not be able to tell on our own or solve on our own. So there's a deep responsibility to saying we need to give voice to these understandings and give voice to these experiences and amplify them in our role in our institutions. Part of this overlap of how we're experiencing not only immediate climate disasters, but also the long-term effects, is that just this generation is embodying much more fully that classic call to both inter- and intra-generational justice and equity. So there are deep questions about how we take on that responsibility, how we own these knowledges and narratives that we see around the world, how we give them space, and how we ingrain that in our policy making to create that justice temporally and geographically. And this understanding of that 360 nature of these conflicts is coming out also in how we see mobilization, protest movements, and action in our generation. We are seeing the generation mobilizing not for single issues, but for systemic injustices. And that's why we're seeing overlaps between movements around healthcare, economic inequalities, climate change, racial and post-colonial injustices, because this is a generation that understands that we've had long-term actions that have brought us where we are today. We're seeing immediate effects of where that's going. And the generation expects institutions to follow through on this approach in their policies and actions to build resilience.